My name is Jess O'Toole, and I'm the Social Sciences and Government Documents Librarian at Georgetown. And in this video, I'm going to talk about finding data. To break that down a little, I'm going to talk about the types of data you might find, where to find that data, and here I will be going into the different organizations that collect and publish data, and the tools that we have here at Georgetown that allow you to search for specific data, data availability and restrictions, data source credibility, and finally, the issue of bias. This video will focus on social sciences data. If you are searching specifically for scientific research data, you might still find this video helpful because much of what I will talk about refers to data in general, but the examples I'm using are going to stay within the social sciences. Types of data. There are some distinctions I think it's important to make when you are searching for data. These distinctions are data versus statistics, microdata versus aggregate data, and cross-sectional data versus time series data. There are other distinctions and definitions that can be important to understand data on a deeper level, but I think these are the most important when you start searching for data. So, data versus statistics. Simply put, data is raw input or information that can undergo some sort of statistical analysis. Statistics are the results of a statistical analysis of the data. That analysis could just mean averaging the individual elements in a data set. That said, data that has undergone statistical analysis can still be used as a data point in research. This happens with aggregate data, which I'll get into now. Microdata versus aggregate data. Microdata often refers to data about individual people. It has not undergone any kind of analysis or summarization. An example of microdata might be individual survey responses. Aggregate data, on the other hand, is data that is the product of some kind of statistical method, which again could be as simple as averaging or adding. The total number of people who own small businesses in the state of Maryland is an example of aggregate data. Cross-sectional data versus time series data. Cross-sectional data is data gathered at a single point in time. That time could be a single day or could span days or weeks. Time series data is data collected at fairly regular intervals over an extended period of time. Time series data can be very valuable to researchers, but is more expensive and time-consuming to collect. One other distinction I want to mention briefly is three major types of social science data collection: administrative data, surveys, and censuses. Administrative data usually refers to official records, and surveys typically concern a sample of a population, while censuses are concerned with everyone or every institution in a population, like every person or every business organization in the United States. Where to find data. There are a few different places you might want to start looking for data, depending on what you're looking for. A lot of data is collected and published by different agencies and organizations, mostly governmental or intergovernmental. So, the U.S. Census Bureau, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the United Nations Statistics Division, the World Health Organization, and more. Data is also available to search in certain specific data search tools, some of which Lowinger Library subscribes to. These search tools often allow you to search across data from different organizations to find what you're looking for. It is increasingly the case that researchers who are publishing social science research papers are encouraged and even required to publish their data as well, so it is often possible to find data associated with a particular research article with the article itself. Aside from as supplementary material, though, where can you find this information? The librarians at Lowinger Library have created research guides. Some are based around a particular subject or type of information, and some are created for specific courses. If you go to the main library website, as I am going to right now, and go to the Research tab at the top of the page, you will see Research and Course Guides listed as an option. Once you get to this page, you will see the guides listed alphabetically by subject. As you can see, we have a specific guide for numeric data, but right now I'm going to go into the guide we have for WGST 251, Gender and the Law. And on this page, I'm going to click on Find Data on the left here. Here we have curated a list of sources that we think would be particularly helpful in locating data relevant to this course. As you can see, the sources of this data are from, like I mentioned a minute ago, various organizations that collect and publish data, and also databases that aggregate data across organizations and individual studies. I'm going to go into a couple of these now just so you can see what their interfaces are like. Let's go into the World Bank Gender Data Portal. As you can see, this allows you to search by indicator. And in this context, indicator is just a statistic used to gauge future trends in a nation's economy. So I will click on Available Indicators here, and you can browse by indicator and narrow down to specific topics. So I am just going to click the first one here, which is about whether or not a woman can apply for a passport in the same way as a man. And you can see the table of information here and the variables listed out here. You can also see that for several of the countries, the data appears to be blank. And this is why it's important to remember to look for some type of About section when you're looking at data and statistics. So the About section here in the Gender Data Portal is linked on the previous page, so I'm going to click on About. And if you scroll down, you'll see that there is a section here for information on data availability and data gaps. There is also a section here for guidelines, manuals, and training materials. And as we go into this page, we'll see that there are a number of materials that talk about different data collection methods, especially with regards to gender. I want to touch on a couple of resources that search across different organizations and studies briefly as well. And for those, I'm going to go into our Numeric Data and Datasets Research Guide. Okay, and I have this open in another tab, but first I'm going to go into Data Planet, which allows you to customize data sets from US and international statistics that are all gathered here. So this is Data Planet. In addition to being able to do a keyword search, and you can see that there's a search box right here, you can also browse by source and subject using the menu on the left here. There are also options to search by economic indicators. Right now, I'm looking at a chart based on data from the current employee statistics database, and it's the number of employees in the private sector in the US over a specific time period. At the top, you can see how you can customize what you're viewing here. I can change this from total private to just goods producing or another industry, and the numbers change. Now, there's not a way to break this particular chart down by gender, but if I scroll down on the left here, women employees is listed as an option. The dates have changed a little bit. They might not have been collecting labor data for women in the earlier years of this survey, but we can see that all of the choices at the top here are still the same. If I scroll down, I will see a description of the data as well as the source of the data. I can go into the original dataset and the Bureau of Labor Statistics website to see if there's more related information. The other resource that I want to mention here is the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, or ICPSR, which is the data archive. You can both find and share data here, so it's important to note that data collection practices and definitions of terms might vary depending on which data set you're looking at, because they are all submitted from different places. Here, you can do a keyword search, but if you like, you can also browse by topic, theme, and by particular series. So I did a keyword search here on gender, and you can see that I have over 9,000 results, the first of which is actually from the World Bank. I can then narrow down my results further depending on what exactly I'm looking for by using one of the limiters on the left side. So I can narrow down by subject term, by geography, by data format, collection method, data type, and more. So those are just some of the resources that we have access to here. Data availability. Because of all of the information available online today, it's tempting to think that the data you're looking for should be available. There are a number of reasons, however, the data might not be available. The first is that it is simply too time-consuming and/or expensive to collect the data. This is especially true of time series data, or data for small municipalities or organizations without the resources to collect data. The second is that data is not collected because of bias, which I will get into more in a couple of slides. And the third is that data is restricted for privacy reasons. Microdata, for instance, is often carefully de-identified to protect personal privacy. This does not just mean that a person's name is removed from the data, but that any data that could potentially be put together to identify them is removed as well. It is very important from an ethical standpoint to protect people's privacy. However, that often means that data from smaller populations or smaller geographic areas is harder to find, because individuals might be easier to identify. For instance, for ages and incomes over a certain level, datasets will often not provide a specific age or income, and will instead just make it clear that the value is over a certain level, a process known as top coding. So you might see an age listed as over 85, rather than a specific number. Leaving out information to protect privacy can risk the accuracy of the data overall, especially for these smaller populations. The current 2020 census, for instance, is using a method called differential privacy to protect residents' privacy, but there are concerns about how this will affect the accuracy of the results. So what do you do if the data you want isn't available? First, you go back to your question that led you to looking for this data and reevaluate. Is there a way to change your research question in a way that fits better with the data that exists publicly? If you look at your research question or topic and determine this is still something you want to pursue, start to look at related data that can build the same picture. This is the same thing you would do with research articles. If you can't find something that's exactly on your research topic, you can still find related research that will be relevant and useful. I dealt with a research question recently about children's health outcomes in Detroit, and how those health outcomes were affected by Detroit's budget cuts in 2014. Not only did I need data about children's health outcomes in Detroit, but I also needed data for a specific time period. And when I was gathering data for this, I realized that some of the relevant data I needed, especially time series data, was for Michigan as a whole rather than just Detroit. I worked to find some good information at the city level, but I supplemented that with information at the state level because that's all that had been gathered and was publicly available. If you do this, it's important to acknowledge any limitations or gaps that exist and connect the data in a way that makes sense. Data source credibility. You are likely already familiar with source credibility and the importance of evaluating sources in research. The same holds true when working with data. You will ask a lot of the same questions. What information do you have about the organization publishing this data? What other types of information do they publish? Why did they gather this data, and what is their purpose in publishing it? Another good thing to try, and this applies to doing any type of source evaluation, is what we call lateral searching, which is basically checking other sources to see if you can verify this data elsewhere. It's also important to look at how transparent the organization publishing the data is about their data collection method and how they define their variables. Over what period of time did they collect the data? How big is the sample size? There's a great blog called Retraction Watch, which has posts of papers that have been retracted or withdrawn from various scholarly journals for one reason or another. You can visit this blog to see papers being retracted for all types of research misconduct, but a fast-growing area of misconduct involves misrepresentation of data. So pay close attention to the details given with any data set that you consider using in your research. Bias. When we talk about bias, what we're really talking about is assumptions. What assumptions are being made by the group collecting and publishing this data? Is there information they didn't even consider relevant that they left out that skewed the results? What assumptions are we making as researchers? What assumptions are we making when we see statistics broken down by gender? How is the particular agency or office collecting and distributing the data defining gender? Many of these offices will offer a glossary of terms to help researchers interpret data, but gender-based data collecting norms are still evolving. In 2019, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe published a review focused on measuring gender identity, with suggestions for data collection that might be applied across countries. However, it is important to always check to see how the particular agency collecting data is defining their terms. At the end of this presentation, I'm going to provide some links, and one of them will be to the United Nations report mentioned here. When we see the term unmarried in a data set, it's useful to remember to ask ourselves whether or not that data point was gathered before or after same-sex marriage was found to be a constitutional right. The Census Bureau actually has some information about how the office has collected information on same-sex couple households over time, and I've linked that in the next slide as well. What about age-related data? I already mentioned that some specific age-related data is kept restricted to avoid potential identification and breach of privacy. But there are other reasons for the omission of data related to people approximately 65 to 75 years of age or older, and this is especially relevant to women, who on average live longer than men. More research is currently being done about the underrepresentation of elderly patients in clinical trials, and on the historic lack of reporting and demographic data on older adults because of their habitation in long-term care facilities. So what does this mean for you as the researcher? It again means that it's important to acknowledge the limitations of the data you find, and to not make assumptions about what data is telling you. You will need to evaluate the data you find not only for credibility, but for suitability to your own research. These are a couple of the resources that I mentioned in the presentation, or that I just think would be useful to you when searching for data. Finally, if you have any questions about finding data or using the library website or anything I went over in this presentation, please reach out to me at my email address listed here. And I'm happy to meet via Zoom for a research consultation or just go back and forth over email.